how might we think about, other kinds of sociality? And so I think this metabolic rift concept allows us to think about how things are, out of whack on both counts, nature as well as human sociality. And reviving or healing nature is not separate from healing ourselves, healing human sociality. How can we, emphasize an economy of care, an economy of compassion, an economy of love, right? How, because if we can't think about our own human sociality as being central to the struggle, we will never address this other side. We cannot fix nature if we can't fix our own nature. In that sense, that's it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Other Armenias podcast. I am your co-host, Tamar Shirinyan.
And I'm your other co-host, Milena Abrahamian.
So before we get into our episode today, I just want to remind everybody, please like this video, like it right now. Just take a second and go and click like. Subscribe to the channel, to Other Armenias if you're not a subscriber. We are also on Spotify, so find us there by looking up Other Armenias podcast on Spotify. Follow us on there, rate us on there. All of that helps. Please comment. You can comment here if you have thoughts about our conversation today or any of other videos. Please do all of the things: like, subscribe, comment, follow, rate, all of the things. Okay, so we're very excited about our episode today. We have as our guest Raja Swamy. Raja is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Tennessee, which also makes him my colleague. And full disclosure, Raja is also my partner and my child's other parent. His first book, Building Back Better, explored the effects of the 2004 tsunami on artisanal fisher communities in southern India, especially as the tsunami was taken by governmental forces, private agencies, and humanitarian NGOs as an opportunity to displace so-called unproductive or backward fisher communities from the coast to develop for the purposes of tourism. Building Back Better uncovered not only these attempts at displacement and development, but also resistance to these plots by local artisanal fisher communities and sympathetic activist NGOs. Today, we are going to be talking about Raja's new book,
which is called Capitalism and Catastrophe, a critical disaster studies manifesto, just out in 2025. So just a small introduction about the book. The book takes on a very ambitious scale, disasters both historically in the era of modernity and the contemporary, as well as across geographic space, taking as case studies the COVID-19 pandemic, fires in Hawaii in 2023, the 2004 tsunami that devastated South Asia, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, Louisiana in the US in 2006, Hurricane Harvey that hit Texas in 2017, causing billions in damage, as well as adding to the already existing devastating toxicity of the city's Black and Latinx neighborhoods, as well as the destruction of Palestine and Gaza by the Zionist entity with the help of the US and European states. The book challenges disaster studies, as well as those who work on disasters within a humanitarian context, to think more seriously about the roles of history, material conditions, and contradictions, as well as resistance, as a part of how we make sense of disasters and how, then, we might imagine real recovery that does not just reproduce the conditions that made the crisis, the disaster, or the catastrophe to begin with. While the book is not while the book is not about Armenia, Tamara and I thought that a discussion on other Armenias about capitalism, disasters, both political and natural, might help shed light on how we understand the many catastrophes in Armenia and how we might develop political forms of analysis to understand these. So, welcome, Raja. Before we sort of start asking you questions, I would love for you to just briefly talk about the cover of the book, of your book.
Thank you. Thank you, Milena. Thank you, Taman. I'm really honored to be here. Appreciate um, this podcast very much, and I'm very honored to be part of it. Thank you. Um, so the cover of the book, Milena, is um, over the last 2 years almost, we've seen a kind of a something that has been variously described as horrific, unprecedented, and so on and so forth, an act of genocide that is notable not only for its scale and its brutality, but also for the incredible impunity that the primary actors involved in this are kind of enjoying while doing this. And the cover of the book was intended to kind of bring attention to and force the gaze onto what is happening in Gaza over the last 2 years. And of course, this is also very, very pertinent because the book's main premise is that we cannot maintain these neat distinctions between natural disasters and other kinds of catastrophes, including war, spectacular events such as genocide, so on and so forth, but also more broadly, thinking about the sort of slow-moving forms of oppression and exploitation that are also part of our contemporary world today. So Gaza is in many ways a case study of catastrophe at the vortex of geopolitics, political economy, settler colonial racism, and a kind of abandonment, if you will, of all of the kind of pretenses of international law, humanitarian law, so on and so forth. We're seeing in real time. So I thought it would be very, very pertinent to bring this image out in front, right, and center in order to situate the book and its main arguments.
Thanks for that, Raja.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So you already mentioned law, and this is, I think, one of the first questions that we want to ask you about your book, but also about the world is so that in the book, one of the ways in which you intervene in the normalized rhetorics of disasters, both within how humanitarian organizations globally operate, but also how academic studies of disasters understand disasters, right? So you link so-called natural disasters to political disasters like imperialist wars, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and so on. But also how normal and not necessarily disaster context, like peoples who live under military occupation, right, are living under catastrophic conditions normally. So this is really critical because, as you point out, what is often taken to be a disaster context is somehow outside of the normal or within it some kind of abnormal time is actually the everyday normal for many people around the world, where they can at any time, at any moment, be killed, displaced, live without the necessities of life, like clean water, food, medicine, and as we're seeing in Gaza so kind of so clearly today. And also really critical to this linking of political catastrophe and so-called natural disasters is the role of liberal democracy, which you challenge in numerous ways throughout the book, especially at the level of how law within liberal democracy actually functions, and with the purposes of disenfranchising whole swaths of populations, and at least in the case of Gaza, the entire population. Can you talk a little bit about this link between the political and the supposedly natural, as well as how this is intricately tied to the post-World War II era that insists on the liberal democratic form being the only possible like legitimate form, and insists on it being the global governance, and how is the normal the very thing that we have to challenge, and how does disaster rhetoric cover up this normal that is already in itself pretty catastrophic? It's a big question.
So in beginning the process of thinking about these these questions, one of the things that I had to kind of really understand better was how this so-called normal is made up. Like, what is this normal, right? Because oftentimes when there's a disaster, we see it as an exceptional moment. Oh, there's a flood, there's an earthquake. How do we go back to normal? How do we bring back normal, right? And I was intrigued by this framing of the normal, because oftentimes when the official kind of discourse around normal begins to kind of flood the media, etc., the understanding is that everything was fine until yesterday, and then suddenly something bad happened. So let's go back to yesterday, right? Or those conditions of yesterday. And I was intrigued by this normal. What makes up this normal? And I think definitely the normal is constituted by law and by conventional understandings of what is normal, right? In the United States, there's often this phrase, like, even Bernie Sanders says, like, let's put people back to work, right? So putting people back to work is the normal, right? Going back to work, paying your rent, obeying the law, right? Paying your fines, etc. That's normal, right? But how did this normal come to be becomes a question of something broader, not just law and shared understandings, popular culture, etc., but also political economy and history, right? Somehow these things came into being the way they are, came into shape the way they are, because of particular kinds of social relations, particular kinds of historical processes, and oftentimes, we don't pay attention to these, but conflicts that may be out in the open, but sometimes they're sort of underlying all social relations, right? These conflicts, these contradictions, these ways in which, like, some people have less and some people have more, some people are unable to pay the rent, some people are being evicted from their homes, right? Those are the factors of the normal that seem to kind of be missed every time we hear official, speak about let's go back to normal, right? So that was one thing that I was kind of like really trying to think about. To go back to the question of law, I've often kind of shared this with many folks. There's an old, like, 17th century poem that's attributed to some anonymous peasant in England who was kind of protesting against the enclosures of the commons. The commons are these shared natural resources, natural spaces, the woods, rivers, grasslands, etc., pasture lands, so on and so forth, shared commonly by people who live within particular communities, right? And you have these sort of user rights over certain things. You have a right to go fish or to farm or to use water, to chop wood, because you belong to village community, or the one particular village community. So the commons is coming under attack by this process of enclosures in the 17th century in England, 17th, 18th, and well into the 19th century. And so this peasant's poem kind of speaks in a very kind of nice and a very almost humorous way to how this is happening and why this is so bad. And I'll just sort of read this poem out just to kind of share with you. And it's always nice to kind of share this because it's insightful and funny at the same time. It's too bad we don't know who the author was. She or he obviously was not just experiencing this, but also had a really sharp eye on what was actually happening, right? So the poem goes this way. Um, the law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. The law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, but leaves the lords and ladies fine who take those things that are yours and mine. The poor and wretched don't escape if they conspire the law to break. This must be so, but they endure, those who conspire to make the law. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese will still a common lack until they go and steal it back. Right? What I do love about this poem is that it speaks to the villainy of power, right? How power beneath is sort of it's sort of nice, calm and stable, face of being normal and conventional, traditional, and so on and so forth, hides and masks conflict, right? Violence, hypocrisy, right? A certain selective way in which some things are considered illegal and some things are considered fine, right? But what I do love about this poem is it in its ending tells us, well, this is going to continue until the geese get together, get their act together, and fight back, right? It speaks to resistance as well, which is as much a part and parcel of the contemporary world that we live in today. as is oppression, exploitation, violence, brutality, and so on and so forth. So your question had many parts to this, Tamar. So if you could kind of maybe refresh what you had asked earlier.
Yeah, so this question about like the way in which, going by the poem that you read, which I know is your favorite poem, is the way in which stealing the commons from the goose, right, is totally, it's law, right? It's totally normal. So theft, so liberal democracy, right? It tells us that what is the law is the good. So the social good is the law. So follow the law and we will all, and this is the social contract, right? Liberal theory, liberalism is entirely established on this question of like, you and I both follow the law and then everything will be fine, right? But the law itself, and this is something that, a lot of, non-liberal theorists and philosophers have drawn attention to. Marx wrote about this, but also Lenin, right, wrote about it in a fascinating way of like, challenging equality as liberal democratic law as democracy and as equality as a farce, because liberal democracy really underneath it is the use of the law in order to create exclusions and inequalities, right? So, which then tells you follow the law and we'll all be fine, but really some people following the law is ultimately their death, right? And or the theft of their land, their resources, their livelihoods, right? So this question of law and as the normal, right? So a disaster comes in the context where a law is operating that has already created disaster and catastrophe for so many people, is now the normal that we're all supposed to get behind to fix the problem that it caused in the first place, or other problems that it is continuously causing. So yeah, I mean, that was my question. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I kind of tried to do, and I try to work this out in the book, which is that the so-called the normal, what I describe in the book as prevailing conditions, right? And I said prevailing conditions because normal kind of suggests something that's static, that's sitting, right? And prevailing conditions allows us to think about things that are in motion, that could get worse but could also get better. If we fight back, we push back, we can actually contest the normal, right? One of the things that one often sees in the aftermath of a disaster, a catastrophic event, is there's an urgency with which official discourse tries to first describe what has happened in very particular ways. And it kind of locks in a certain way by which we can understand what has happened, right? And it does so for very particular reasons, because once you do that, once you monopolize how something can be understood, then you can also monopolize what the solution is. Right? How we can understand what the solution is. Now you say like, well, what is really needed now? And in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, for example, right? Or Hurricane Harvey in Houston. The argument being that, well, we didn't have sufficient kind of instead of looking at why things happened the way they did, on account of long historical processes of building where you shouldn't be building, or encouraging various kinds of industrial activities that are making communities very vulnerable. Instead of questioning those things, we bring it down to one or two or three or four, or a finite number of causes, and then suggest that what we need is a set of solutions that are consistent with what we already want, right? So here's where, if in the day before the disaster, if there were efforts to get rid of public housing, if there were efforts to get rid of public schools, if there are efforts to dislocate people, right? The disaster now becomes a way by which powerful entities, very capital friendly states, corporations, even humanitarian agencies read the problem, read the crisis in particular ways that makes it amenable to the kinds of changes they want or they imagine to be the only solution possible, right? You mentioned, Tamar, liberal democracy as the only way in which we can think about this, right? Which forecloses questions of redistribution, which forecloses questions of, empowering the working class, which forecloses questions of, indigenous people laying claim to their sovereign rights over land and resources, over futures, over time, right? And these are ways in which disaster contexts become moments where some scholars use terms like disaster capitalism, right? And I kind of I find that useful, but not entirely useful because it doesn't speak to the messiness and complexity of history, and very importantly to the potentialities underlying resistant populations, right? What resistant populations can actually do in the aftermath, what they might do, or what they are prevented from doing. Those questions we require a broader framing, right, to address those questions. So yeah, what happens in the aftermath becomes now a kind of almost a formulaic kind of a continuation of what preceded. And that becomes a way by which, we can now say, hey, the only way in which we can recover, like in a city like New Orleans, is to have more privatization. The only way we can rebuild is by, empowering the real estate lobbies. The only way we can kind of bring back economic, productivity or energies in this particular society is by empowering capital, is by making it more profitable for companies, or by forcing the government now, or the government channeling its resources into building infrastructure with the hope that this will bring in investment. Investment is how we recover, etc., etc. This completely drives out like what local communities want, what working people needed, and very dangerously so. What this also does is it completely seeks to erase ongoing struggles. If there were efforts to unionize prior to the disaster, and I talk about this in the context of New Orleans, efforts to create independent unions to get job security, to increase wages, to have better conditions of life, or if there were efforts to defend public housing from efforts from continuing attempts to dismantle public housing, if there were these sort of mobilizations to push back against it, those now become targeted as being problematic. Say like, oh, unions are bad, communities fighting for public housing, that's bad. What we need is private investment, private industry, privatization of schools, privatization of public utilities, and so on and so forth. And this, in a sense, is the messiness of this so-called normal that I'm trying to address in the book.
Can I just say something that I think is really interesting in this kind of moments of disaster? It's so easy to use fear to really try to sort of like make people, because people, I mean, we are animals, like these things affect, you feel like you're under threat if there's just like an earthquake, or you just lost your home, or like it's like just it's about your life and you're continuing to live, right? And so you are so vulnerable in that moment, and it can be so easy to just use this fear to kind of try to even make you kind of doubt what you even need in that moment. As you say, like people know nobody asks people what they need. I mean, you need time, you need space. I'm also thinking about how all the things you're saying, like, oh, we need privatization, we need this, we need that, like the things that the normal or what is trying to be pushed on people in the aftermath is also under this kind of like framing of security and safety. And it's just a basic human need, and you have somebody who's saying, well, this will make your life safer and you will become more secure. And it's, again, like, I mean, this poem was so great just to look at the basic kind of like what is actually happening and what you are being told is happening. And then in a moment of vulnerability, it can be so easy to manipulate like people and their fears, yeah, it's just as you speak, that's what I started to think about.
I'm reminded of when you asked that, Milena, of fisher communities in South India when I did my first project. in these villages that they were being told in the initial weeks after that, you can't live here anymore because it's too dangerous, right? And of course, in the first several months, uh, almost a year, a lot of people were just like very badly traumatized because they faced a horrendous loss of life. People still remember their loved ones having been killed and having lost their homes, and so the trauma kind of had that long impact, right? And then so people were kind of somewhat trusting of this notion that it's safer to not go back there. But then, in the name of recovery, the authorities were like, hey, let's develop this place. Let's bring in heritage tourism. Let's bring in hotels and resorts and so on and so forth. And then people are like, hey, if it's not safe for us, how is it safe for these other people who come here, right? And you know, then it became a little clear, and then you realize like safety and security is increasingly becoming the sort of the way in which not just the World Bank, but also I mean the sort of securitized apparatus, the military industrial apparatus, right, around the world is trying to think about all these problems through security, right? And safety and security can blur the lines between disaster recovery and bringing more police and military. New Orleans, again, classic example. After Hurricane Katrina devastated the city in 2005, they brought in like mercenaries who had just been doing terrible things in Iraq, like Blackwater. They were brought into the streets of New Orleans to secure the city. And here it wasn't just about fighting floodwaters. It was about fighting poor people who are struggling to kind of stay in their homes or try retrieve their belongings, trying to find means of sustenance, food, etc., etc. These all become now insurgents or become problematic subjects that must be in the name of security must be disciplined, must be put here, put there, put in camps, put in detention centers, so on and so forth, right? So security now blurs the lines between disaster relief and other kinds of political projects like dispossession or dislocation. And this is happening across the board, which is quite like shocking. But to be fair, I think people are also starting to see how this all works and are fighting back. And that's the other interesting thing is they're seeing the links between what's happening in the name of disaster recovery and the kinds of dispossessions and dislocations that are happening in contexts that are more of a more overt political nature, right? War, displacement, kind of dislocation. I was seeing in Gaza, right? In the name of making the apartheid entity secure, now they want to drive out 2.3 million people from Gaza, from their own from their own homeland, right? And so the security rhetoric also, I agree, it is very compelling, can be very powerful at times, but because again, people also at the receiving end of power tend to also see through these things in ways that most of us are not able to. They can also say like, hey, if it's about security, what the hell are you talking about? What about my security? What about my safety? Right? How am I safe if I don't have a livelihood, if I don't have income, if I don't have a home, if I lose my connection to my village community? How am I secure? Right? That's all I mean.
Yeah, and what that security rhetoric is of course like so intense when it comes to Gaza. But one of the other things that I was thinking about as you were talking about prevailing conditions is the way in which, right, let's just return back to normal, has been also the liberal rhetoric around Gaza, right? That we need a ceasefire and we need an end to the war, or I mean, like worse is like we need an end to the conflict, a peaceful resolution, right? But the prevailing condition, right, the conditions of Gaza, and not just Gaza, of Palestine, has been military occupation, has been the kidnapping and torture of people, sometimes children in prisons, has been an apartheid state, has been a siege even before the total blockade on food, has been a total siege, right? Like where every calorie is counted, every ounce of water is accounted for, even how much much internet can get into Gaza was accounted for, right? So if that's the normal, right, the whole point of this is not going back to, you know, how things were or normal, right? This is a moment in which and you know, you know, do this in the book through conjectural analysis, but the whole point of this really should be to see how, right, the prevailing conditions were disastrous already, right? And this is both an eventful, exceptional moment, but also very much not that, right? Not exceptional.
And to think about that, sort of going back to normal, I'm reminded of Houston and the 2017 Hurricane Harvey. And one of the things that was often kind of left out was that the flooding was catastrophic. Clearly, it was unprecedented flooding. Um, but the flooding combined with industrial accidents produced an extremely dangerous set of circumstances, particularly for Black and Latinx communities living in the industrial zone of the city. So here, floodwaters overwhelmed storage tanks containing benzene or gasoline tanks, and those got released in the water, and people are now exposed to and the air, and people are now exposed to living in these places where they're being told by the authorities to shelter in place, where you're supposed to close all your windows and sit inside your house and wait so the floodwaters subside so you can get out. But they're in there choking because there's all this these chemicals now that are now part of this swirling mix of a disaster. Now, when they say let's go back to normal, right, and return back to the example of Gaza, like when the U.S. and the Israeli state say let's go back to peace, right, they want to go back to October 6th, 2023. But on October 6th, 2023, Gaza was in its 17th year of being a concentration camp, stifled, besieged. Whereas you rightly point out, Darrell Lee, the anthropologist, made this argument where, pointed to how the Israeli authorities basically, meticulously calculated how many calories of food will be allowed into Gaza. Right? This is going from 2007 or 2009 till 2023. I mean, this is like a long period of time. There's been this sort of stifling besiegement, siege that has characterized normal. Or in Houston, to go back to normal now means, people have to go back to living in their homes where they're constantly breathing all these terrifyingly dangerous toxins that don't kill them instantly, but that kill them over time. And these are neighborhoods that have the highest rates of childhood cancer, leukemia, asthma. I mean, horrendous mortality stretched out over time. So under liberal democracy, to live under conditions that kill you slowly are permissible. They're okay. To live under conditions that kill you instantly are bad. Right? So let's go from the sort of quick and spectacular forms of structural violence to permissible forms of violence where you can drink polluted water, you can breathe polluted air. Over time your children can be exposed to cancer, etc. Over time, that's considered okay because the kind of capitalist economy thrives on this model of slow violence. Rob Nixon uses this term, slow violence, right? Because this is how you kind of defer all the costs of your production and your profit making, right? You pass it on to somebody else, send it off somewhere else, right? They send toxic waste. Lawrence Summers, former president of the World Bank, in a kind of secret memo in the World Bank, had made this argument, really horrendous argument, that Africa is underpolluted. Right? We need to take advantage of the fact that here's an underpolluted part of the world where it's okay because these are non-white folks. We can just go and dump toxic waste on them, right? And this is in the interest of enabling capital to continue accumulating and growing while passing the costs on to somebody else, or passing it on to future generations to deal with, right? In this sense, so normal in that sense, going back to normal can be a really terrifyingly threatening reality if we actually examine it through historical and political economic lenses. And if I might add, also ecological lenses, because we're thinking about climate change as a no longer a ticking time bomb. We're actually in the sort of moment where things are actually falling apart via climate change as we speak.
I'm actually kind of losing my breath as you speak, Raja, because I'm just like, what? What? Like some of the things you're saying are very new to me, and I'm just really like, I'm. I mean, before we started today's episode, I just kept saying I'm really depressed now, and Raja and Tama were like, we didn't even start recording yet. So I just want to make sure that people who are listening to us, you know, if you're feeling like shit hearing all of this, good. But I do want to go to our next second question because you mentioned you talk about time now, and really time, especially a conjectural analysis, is also key to your book's main argument and intervention. So can you talk a little bit about how you are thinking about time, both everyday time, like how our lives structured through everyday rhythmic cycles and how those are impeded upon by various structures and systems. So you just spoke about it a little bit in terms of sort of people sort of slowly like breathing these chemicals and dying, but if there are other ways or examples, and how those and also larger time frames like eras, the era of neoliberalism or its current era of collapse, as you seem to argue. So why is time so intrinsic to understanding crises, catastrophes, disasters, as well as resistance and struggle?
Well, thank you for the question, Milena. Time is, I mean, the urgency of thinking about time and thinking with time is perhaps in this moment in history, is much more striking than perhaps any time before. Because one of the things that really kind of shocked me was to think about how, like, we think about disastrous events or catastrophic events and then the return to normal within these short little frames, right? Historical time. We're thinking about, oh yeah, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 7 years, even 100 years ago. And then we're in a moment of, the moment of climate change, as some scholars use the term Anthropocene, right? A kind of an epochal time where, time in this big sense, right? Uh, um, as distinct from other kind of geological chunks of time, like earlier eras, like the Holocene, the Pleistocene, or Miocene, so on and so forth. We're thinking about planetary geological time now, stretching hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, well into the kind of the origins of the Earth's, of the Earth itself, right? Now, if human activity is having such an impact that within the last, scholars kind of are divided on this, either the last 200 years or some folks say the last 70 years, since 1950s or so, right? We've seen a profound transformation where human beings have become a geological force. Like, we're now impacting the planet at such a level that we're transforming the ways in which so-called Earth system functions, right? So the stable climate that we've been accustomed to for 100,000 years or so is now coming out about 10,000 years or so is now coming undone within the last 150 to the last 200 years, right, since the Industrial Revolution. Especially in the last 50 years, and especially in the last 20 years, we've seen massive increases, right? Median temperatures are rising every year. We're seeing, we're seeing changes that are profoundly kind of, forcing us to profoundly change how we think about time, right? Now, then there's the other time of disasters and recovery and so on, right? So Hurricane Harvey happens to 2017. Within 6 months, the city of Houston is putting up banners saying, Houston strong, right? Recovery has happened, right? Houston is back. We're rebounded, etc., etc. I was talking to folks. I was speaking to this pastor in a church, and he's telling me about about how people who come to his church are still struggling with what happened 10 years ago, flooding events, other hurricanes. People in his church are still like needing help with rent and food and so on and so forth, dealing with unemployment, dealing with having their homes foreclosed, right? So temporal cycles here now, or temporal scales here, need to be sort of we need to bring these all together. Now, how is this related to geological time? Well, Hurricane Harvey apparently was unprecedented in its ferocity because of one major factor that's often underreported on, talked less about, which is global warming. Apparently, the waters in the Gulf of Mexico were so hot that within a few hours of it making landfall, Hurricane Harvey apparently loaded itself, got supercharged with massive quantities of water. And we've seen similar things happen last year in the fall of 2024 in Appalachia, in the southeastern United States, right? Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina were massively affected by Hurricane Helene, which also packed a punch. And this is an area that's, does not really get affected by hurricanes very much because it's way inland. But this Hurricane Helene, which kind of made landfall near Florida, made its way into Appalachia, holding enormous quantities of water that it just dumped. Right. So clearly, geological time needs to be thought in conjunction with everyday time that we're accustomed, historical time. Right, the flood event of today is related to these sort of epochal changes that are taking place. Why is global warming happening? Scholars across the board will tell you one of the prime drivers of global warming is human activity, particularly fossil fuels. Fossil capitalism is a major driver of global warming. Right. So back to Houston. Epochal time, this sort of Hurricane Harvey that's being supercharged with massive quantities of water. Major driver there is, of course, fossil capitalism. And Houston, without suggesting that its own industries produced Hurricane Harvey, that's not at all the suggestion here. A student once challenged me on this. Are you saying that Houston's petroleum industries were the cause of Hurricane Harvey? Not directly, but indirectly. By producing constantly these emissions, right? Because of this need for profits, endless profits, the petroleum industry, the petrochemical industry, and capitalism largely, more broadly, is producing conditions that are supercharging these storms that are now coming back to hit us really badly, right? So the sort of ways in which human societies are so badly kind of positioned at the vortex of this sort of epochal changes now taking place on the one hand, and these sort of micro transformations having to do with home foreclosure, job loss, stagnant wages, the kind of loss of educational opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How to bring these two together and to think about this. So rhythm as a way of thinking about how human beings don't just simply live in this sort of linear time, right? We live in cyclical time in the sense that we experience this biologically, of course, and some biologists somewhere said something to the effect that billions of cells are constantly dying and being reborn in our bodies every second, like constantly. I mean, or every day. I don't know how soon that happens, but it's constantly happening, right? We're dying and living at the same time, and of course it's a losing game because we are dying eventually, right? But this nature of time now, going from that biological need to reproduce and remake and replenish and revive ourselves every day to social time, which is dominated today by capital. Right? We need a job. We need wages. We need to pay the rent on time. We need to pay those bills on time, right? Oh, you missed the deadline, they tell us, right? Or, it's too late for this, right? Or it's too early for this, right? We think about time in these ways as a matter of social life. We are constantly embedded within these relationships that are dominated heavily by capital, and we're kind of suspended within these relations through time. Now, how do we think about time in that sense, where the need to reproduce ourselves, remake ourselves, is contingent on our ability to get a paycheck, to pay the bills, to constantly keep have to catch up with the rising cost of living? Like in Knoxville, this city where we live, rents are going up every year, shot through the sky, through the roof, while wages are not keeping up. Wages are not keeping up, rents are going up. Cost of living keeps going up, but wages are not keeping up. So you have to pay more for the same things that you need to survive, while your your paycheck remains the same, right? Stagnates. In the United States, the real wages of the working class has stagnated for about 40 years now, while profits for private companies have been going through the roof, right? So how do we kind of think about time in these ways? Our inability to keep up these rhythmic cycles of social reproduction when capital's demands and needs constantly impose new pressures on us, make it more and more difficult. Right, so that's another reason why rhythm becomes so important, right? So rhythm analysis, and a concept developed by Henri Lefebvre, the French Marxist geographer, I found incredibly useful for us and absolutely vital for us to think about today in terms of how we can remake ourselves, or how we're prevented from remaking ourselves on a day-to-day basis, while capital's need to remake itself and replenish its coffers every day constantly imposes new challenges on us, right? So time from the geological sense to time to the biological micro sense to time in the social sense. Now turning to conjuncture. When I think about conjuncture largely, following Stuart Hall and its incredibly important framing, when a particular set of conditions change, it's a sort of an epochal shift we think about. No, epochal not in the geological sense, but epochal in the historical sense. Right, we're going from a kind of the era of Keynesian economics to an era of neoliberalism. Right, that's an kind of epochal shift where the common sense of one era no longer holds true in this era. So the common sense of the 1960s in much of the Western world revolved around, stable jobs, working for a company, start the concept of the career, for example. Right, you joined a company when you were like 22 or something, and then you retired when you were 60, and you were in the same company and you built yourself up. And when I got my first job, my father, my late father, said to me was work hard and make sure to get a promotion, right? And his model was that old Keynesian model, which is that you join something, you be loyal, you work hard, and you stay there, until you retire, right? Today, people are talking about having three jobs. People are talking about like, I work these jobs and then I drive Uber on the weekend, or I'm doing some online work for somebody while I'm also holding down two other jobs, right? And time, the fragmentation of time in this kind of model, in this context, presents a different set of challenges for us. Right? So this conjuncture, the neoliberal era, late neoliberal era, this conjuncture then completely changes the common sense through which we, what prevailed before. But by that same token, while the conjuncture imposes new challenges or presents new challenges for us, these conjunctures also, for Stuart Hall, important moments to think politically. How can we also fight back, right? And to fight back today means different things than what it was, what it meant, say, in the 1960s, right? So to fight back today presents new kinds of challenges. This is why, I talk about, independent unions in New Orleans, for example, fighting back, but also community organizing, right? Where people like local communities are organized in different ways. Efforts at building mutual aid networks, for example, right? These are means by which people in these new in these new contexts that they find themselves, where the speak of law, simply appealing to the law is not going to do it. You want the union to stand for you? Well, a lot of mainstream unions have been completely bought off, right? So they're not going to help you. Independent organizing, community organizing, etc., becomes these sort of new platforms. And to go back to an earlier question that we talked about before before this episode, Milena, you mentioned NGOs, right? And non-governmental organizations have, of course, been justifiably criticized a lot over the last 20, 30 years because of ways in which they've depoliticized populations, ways in which they've become kind of complicit in various kinds of activities of capital and state, etc., displacing people, so on and so forth. But NGOs are also platforms where people are taking their struggles to. And these are also places where people, with the lack of, there's no political party representing the working class in much of the West, right? Anymore. Even the labor in the UK is like completely beholden to big capital, right? There are no kind of legal options in many parts of the world for people to say, hey, this company is polluting this land. We want to use a legal kind of mechanism to fight back. I'm not suggesting that they're completely inaccessible, but they're getting really, really difficult to do so because of the ways in which law itself has become complicit in many parts of the world with the claims of power. So here, you know, other forms of resistance, other forms of pushing back, right? In this conjuncture, we're seeing new modes of organizing, new ways of building, and I think in this time, both on account of climate change, but also the fight against genocide, the kind of global organizing against what's happening in Gaza. I think these present very important kind of moments for us to think about resistance on a planetary scale, where we can't any longer, just as we say, we critique and say you can't separate a natural disaster from a political disaster. I think we should also embrace the reality that today fighting for climate justice is the same as fighting for for wages, fighting for equal rights, fighting for gender justice, fighting against genocide, fighting for socialism, fighting for good things. We want to say fighting against this and that, right? Fighting for, and to articulate a new vision so we can now turn this conjuncture into a set of opportunities for the population on Earth and our non-human fellow travelers on this planet to have a future outside of capital, outside of empire, beyond capital, beyond patriarchy. We can build something new, right? Now, this is why I think about conjuncture as being really valuable for us in this moment. Sorry, I kind of went all over the place, but I hope that was helpful.
I mean, yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
No, I mean that was really helpful, and one of the things that I mean, the book has so much in it that it's hard, of course, to talk during a short conversation like this about all of it. But one of the things that you bring up that I think has global impact, for everyone, no matter where. And of course, most of our audience is Armenian, but this is something that affects Armenians and all over the world. Everybody is the question of pandemics. And one of the things about temporality that I think is really key about the most recent major pandemic. I mean, we might think about pandemic in various, and cancer is a pandemic, right? Also caused by a lot of these factors, caused by the cycles of capital, caused by all of the things that also cause climate change, toxicity and all of that. But the COVID-19 pandemic, to think about a classic pandemic, or one that's been called that, is also caused by these cycles of time. First, the social dimension, the rhythmic time of the quickening of movement throughout the world, right? Where there are like millions of people whose bodies circulate in a day from one end of the world to the other, bringing all of these social contexts together. But also the fact that deforestation over a longer period of time, and the way in which the earth no longer contains certain things that are pathogens to human beings, because of animal agriculture, deforestation linked to that, right? So forests can no longer contain diseases, separating them from social worlds, and animal agriculture is constantly producing pathogens that can become viral and devastate human as well as non-human life. That these are two temporalities that in some ways are in conjunction with each other to make for the perfect conditions for a global pandemic that really risks life, human life as we know it.
Yeah, I mean, with the pandemic, I mean, it's interesting because it seems like COVID-19 kind of was a reminder that these boundaries we kind of operate within, right? Nation states and even regions, right? Uh, are in many ways like completely, useless when it comes down to it. I mean, of course, with climate change, you're seeing a lot of this, right? I mean, hurricanes don't kind of stop at the border and kind of, you know, or even pollution. I mean, um, So we're all in it together, of course, unequally, very unequally, and we're not all responsible for it. Clearly, this is very important to keep in mind. Um, but yes, with the pandemic, the the driving force here, I mean, largely is deforestation, no doubt, and it's being pushed by commercial agriculture, largely, right? Deforesting in Indonesia is about expanding palm oil cultivation, and in addition to the tremendous violence that is that's part of that whole operation, where indigenous populations, non-human populations of orangutans and other mammals and other non-mammal populations, the devastation that's wrought on these regions. In addition to that, you produce these things for what? Palm oil's primary role is as a food additive, as something that's used in various kinds of processed foods. And it's not because people are hungering for palm, but it's because this is what the profit model is, right? So I often tell my students, I said, always think, right? This is going back to good old Marx: use value, exchange value, right? What do we produce for? Most often we're told that we need a commodity, this or that or that or the other, because we need those things to use, right? Well, we're thinking as consumers, like, I need water because I want to use water to drink, right? But the one who sold me this is not interested in my use of it. The one who sold me this is interested in the exchange value that is obtained when he or she sells me this, right? So capital driven by exchange value is actually devastating the planet, right? And is creating conditions that are rife for these kinds of terrifying events like pandemics. I mean, it's really scary to think about, but the permafrost, where much of the Siberian permafrost, as it melts, as it thaws, as it defrosts, is releasing pathogens that have been dormant for tens of thousands of years. And these pathogens are going to come out looking at humans and saying, hey, wow, you know, something good to
Here.
to infect, right? And we have no defenses because we have no idea what these pathogens are, right? And this stuff is going to go across the board. And in this context, I mean, again, thinking about pandemic as a kind of as a disaster in the making, along with climate change, is really useful, because oftentimes pandemics are seen as again, the whole thing. Did it start in Wuhan? Did it happen in this place? Did it happen there? Those are pertinent questions, no doubt. Let's ask, the kind of the etiology of a disease is important to determine, so we can figure out how to cure a disease, no doubt, right? And scientists are, of course, doing that stuff. But what's also important to grasp is the systemic drivers of this process, because that's sort of not being allowed to be spoken of, right? The same World Bank is pushing for commercial fisheries, commercial agriculture, et cetera, completely oblivious to, or at least publicly oblivious to, the fact that these are the drivers of these terrifying events like pandemics, right? And deforestation, of course, is also associated closely with massive flooding. One of the reasons why parts of the Himalayas are becoming so prone to increasing flooding, followed by drought, because then there's nothing's holding the water, and all that water goes away, and then you have water scarcity, right? This is because of deforestation, and deforestation is being driven by in various kinds of industrial activities, commercial agriculture, so on and so forth. And so, I mean, again, coming back down to capital, which is why the book is titled Capitalism and Catastrophe, because in all kinds of ways, we're faced with this question, right? How do we envision a world where, first, we can survive as human beings, given the kinds of forms of violence, historical violence that capitalism constantly, not because of some inadvertent effects, not that capital wasn't too smart yesterday. It can be smart because of green capitalism, or blue capitalism, whatever, right? No, capital by itself, because it prioritizes exchange value over use value in all of its assessments, all of its calculations, all of its planning, is driven by exchange value. Profit and the need to accumulate more and more and more is basically signing the death warrant for planet Earth. And we've got to think planetarily. And this comes back to another question, which is that, yes, we critique imperialism and we critique war and conflict, and we kind of want to name names and call out those players, right? But unless we think planetarily, we can't even address imperialism effectively. And I think that's an argument that becomes a little difficult because we don't want to go off into the sort of romanticized sense of, oh, we're all in this together as a planet, etc., etc. How do we all like hold hands and, heal, right? How do we fight capitalism as a planetary question? And this brings us back to the old questions that, you know, um, um, socialists of the 20th century raised. How do we have an internationalist perspective? How do we revive an internationalist perspective that's anti-imperialist, that is driven by a need to see beyond the narrow confines, right? I mean, India and Pakistan had a stupid war, right? Absolutely absurd, stupid war, right? And the people who were affected by that are working poor people on both sides. And the people who are thriving as a result of the war are the rich, parasitical classes on both sides. Right, and this is why, I mean, think about flooding in Armenia, or the pandemic, right? Or thinking about like climate-induced hurricanes, right? That have effects across regions, that have no respect for national boundaries, that don't give a shit about visas and passports, right? They affect everybody. We have to develop a planetary framework, and for this, an internationalist, eco-socialist approach is, I argue, the only pathway that we can see that names both capital and the various kinds of violences that are associated with capital today, and as a way to kind of not only name them, but to also develop adequate mechanisms to fight them, right? And so, in opposition to the sort of exchange value focused system of production, we're not saying let's go back to kind of some 19th century idyllic rural world. No, let's build, let's make, but with a focus on use values. We want food production, yes, food production in order to address the needs of people who need to eat, not in order to address the needs of corporations that need to turn a profit, right? Reviving those values are necessary.
As you're speaking and you're, sort of saying like to have, the ideas that you have for the vision of how we can sort of move beyond or past these things, and with the planetary way of looking at and the international way of looking at finding ways out of the situation we are in now. I'm just sensing how, like, I'm hearing it, and I keep asking myself how, and I'm like, but there was a time, like when you throughout the whole this whole episode, I keep thinking about images. I have images coming to me of how things used to be when I was a child in Armenia, in Soviet Armenia, where there was other ways that social relations were organized that has been so like violently and like so in such a harsh way, like you know like I don't know what, destroyed, disrupted, obliterated, and almost to the extent that I could feel ashamed to knock on my neighbor's door to ask for salt. you
Mm.
know it's like that's not how it should be. That was never how it was. And I'm just like, but why are we even supposed to think about, like, why should I even ask myself, how do we do this? It's like there was a time there was a time where this was being done in a way, right? Or this was the norm, let's say. Like this was part of the normal. I'm not trying to romanticize and say that everything was ideal. At the same time, there was so much destruction of how people used to organize their lives, and everyday living and time. Also, when we talk about time, like honestly, like I honestly feel like it like time has also sped up. Like if there was a time when time was slower, like physically and just physically, like in terms of or physics, like now it's just, I don't know, it's faster, it just is. And I think it's because, as you say, humans are, what's the word you use, the geological force. I think we are like running like, like insane. So I don't know how to, like, it's almost like, how do you, yeah, I don't, I really trust the earth to do that for me and me as part of the earth how somehow, you know. Um, but I mean, to come back to Armenia, I just wanted to say, you know, when you talked about palm, I just had the image or remembered the first time I ate a banana in Armenia. That was a huge fucking deal for everyone. You know, it was like, wow, it was like you get your hands on this exotic thing that is, you know, not, it was not accessible to you before the Iron Curtain fell. Or, you know, I don't know if we want to use this terminology, but I don't care. I use whatever I know, right? Um, and you know the way, and also I remember how, you know, exotic Coca-Cola was for us, like Fanta, like, and it was just like, you know, like these things that were coming from this capitalist world that we really desired, and we were told we were, it wasn't just, you know, like I didn't need to eat a banana, like we don't need to eat bananas in this part of the world. We have a lot of other things, you know, like that's just growing here a lot, you know. It's like ah. So yeah, I'm just thinking about sort of Armenia and how we are also part of the global, you know, all of these things, and also, and why was I saying about the bananas? Because I think that that has a lot to do with the disaster of the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union in a way, because that allowed for like the entry of, you know, capitalism into this space as if that's the norm, or that's just sort of what should be, what should exist here. And then that bringing in a catastrophe of its own in terms of how, you know, when I talk about how social relations and organizing of social life has been disrupted so strongly, I really do think that it's part of this, the way that it's sort of, if I were to trace it or try to make it like make it a map or an image, you know, visual, it would be clear that it is with all of these commodities and all of this kind of also like sort of making people sort of think that they desire something that maybe they didn't think that they desired before. Um, yeah, and I mean, and I think it was easy to do that here also because of all of the other disasters that it was, you know, on top of at the time. You know, we talked about the earthquake in 1988 in Gyumri. We talk about the war in which in the 90s, you know, that is still sort of really not resolved and is still ongoing. You know, you talked about the floods, you know, in May last year, but I mean, this is not any, we have tornadoes now in Shidak region, which is like more of a dry region. We have tornadoes. Like it's insane that we have tornadoes now, you know, in this country. So yeah, I don't know if I have a question about that. I know you're not an expert on Armenian, you know, on the context here. And I'm also not an expert in sort of disaster studies to be able to make the links, but I am sort of trying to do that. And maybe Tamar, you have something to say on that also.
Thank you, Marina.
If I could just also say something like that, that example with the banana is really interesting because it's also like as um this moment of catastrophe in Armenia, which was the simultaneous breakup of the Soviet Union that left Armenia an independent, you know, nation state that is like celebrated in this moment, but which means that it doesn't actually have any material networks that connect it in the way that it survived on for like 7 fucking decades, but also all happening simultaneously during a war, right? And on top of that, like just a couple of years prior had been devastated by a massive earthquake, right? So this in itself, right, to borrow from Raja's language in the book is a it's a conjuncture of sorts, but it's fascinating. And this also goes to, you know, Raja, what you write about how it's not just the, you know, it's not just like what caused a disaster or how a disaster is being how the disaster is attempts to be recovered by various forces on, but how all of this is represented, right? How information and knowledge and naming and also framing into a particular time, an event, and a population as vulnerable to a disaster and all of this happens. This happens in media. It happens in the approaches by international as well as local humanitarian organizations. But in Armenia, right, it's all this massive conjuncture of disasters that was catastrophic, was represented as this is excellent. We have access to bananas and all of these other, new commodities, and Coca-Cola, and now Snickers, and all of these, and eventually one day, hopefully, Armenia will have a Starbucks and a McDonald's too, because that's been, a desire for a long time. And so how representation works in that way is fascinating, right? Like, I look at it, I see, the kind of the crumbling of what was an entire world, and that gets represented as freedom, as wonderful new access to consumer goods, and all of these things.
It's interesting that this relationship between consumption and kind of well-being, right? This argument that's often made, and I grew up also around a time where India's sort of semi-socialist economy was being transformed into a kind of more free market model. And I remember as a child, I mean, if some kids, family got them, Kit Kat or something, we would all call it foreign chocolate, and everybody wanted, be really friendly with this kid, so they give them a little bite, right? Things like that, right? And to see this model of consumption is fascinating, because this is across the board. It's happening in Armenia, it's happening in India, it's happening in Indonesia, happening in Nigeria. I mean, it's happening everywhere, right? This idea that somehow consuming a particular kind of commodity, this discrete little object, that not just gives you that taste of chocolate or banana or whatever, it also elevates you. It kind of gives you some kind of sense of, I've arrived. I've arrived finally. I'm not just eating local, sweets, but I'm eating foreign chocolate. I'm not just eating, like, I don't know, apricots or whatever. I'm eating bananas, right? So it's sort of this sense of arrival. But what's interesting in all of these is the way in which the conditions that make possible this are hidden from sight. We don't see them. We don't know what happened to make that banana, right? The farms that were fumigated, the farmers who were unwaged, the people who were displaced from land to open up banana plantations, the company that kind of, is simultaneously overthrowing a government while raising banana plantations, right? I mean, that violence of capital is often hidden. And again, this goes back to that whole thing, right? That sort of exchange value is, its conditions are hidden away from us. So we prioritize the particular use value that's in the particular commodity, right? We just look at this, we peel the banana, eat it, and we have that experience, right? As opposed to thinking about it as something that's part of a process. So in that sense, I mean, I'm thinking now about, like, how, maybe one way to bring to light these processes is to really think about consumption, and to really think about consumption. I'm kind of reminded that, one thing I argue about in the book and kind of discuss is this concept of the metabolic rift. Right? This is something that in eco-socialism has become a really important idea, and sort of attributed to or traced back to Marx, where there's two dimensions. One is capital is out of step with nature, and that's clear, right? Deforestation, riding roughshod on nature, dumping, like polluting, etc., etc. But it's also at odds with human socialities, and this brings me back to the point you made, Milena, about how other kinds of sociality used to predominate, right, prior to the arrival, the sort of full arrival of a free market economy, right? Other kinds of sociality where you could, you could have these relationships with the neighbors, or with people in the community, where you could kind of think about these things in more broad ways than just I'm a consumer. I have money in my pocket. I go to the market. I have this exchange with the shopkeeper. I buy a banana or a bar of chocolate, and I consume it and I experience modernity, right? Instead of that model, how might we think about other kinds of sociality? And so I think this metabolic rift concept allows us to think about how things are out of whack on both counts, nature as well as human sociality. And reviving or healing nature is not separate from healing ourselves, healing human sociality. How can we, emphasize an economy of care, an economy of compassion, an economy of love, right? Because if we can't think about our own human sociality as being central to the struggle, we will never address this other side. We cannot fix nature if we can't fix our own nature in that sense. That's it.
So there's hope.
Hope in these dark times. Like I love Gramsci's point about pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. You must always will for better things, better times.
I mean, this could be a moment. I mean, unless you have something more to ask, Tamad, or if you want to say something more, Raja. I mean, we can go on and talk about this even more, and make more links. And I was actually thinking, like, when I was reading through the book, I was like, I want to ask Raja, like, let's sit and like brainstorm like some interesting ways of how we can find solutions, or find some creative things, ways out or ways to resist. So, I mean, we can do that.
I mean,
But I think that, yeah.
that I also wanted to, note the way, Milena, you were saying that, I keep wondering how, but then I realized that world in which the how had already was already on course, was there. I mean, of course, the Soviet Union was by no means perfect. It was a state, and it was also incredibly mega developmentally, so like lots of mega development projects. And we before we started recording, we were talking about like how some of those projects are still having effects in Armenia, in various ways. But it's also the first of all, the internationalism of the Soviet Union really got at that whole, like, these things don't recognize, right? Climate change doesn't recognize borders, pandemics don't recognize borders, human sociality and mutual aid don't recognize, should not recognize borders and boundaries between people. But also the ways in which, the decisions in the Soviet Union, whatever it is that we say about the Soviet Union, I mean, one thing that was not, happening was the decisions around what is going to be produced and how it's going to be produced for the bottom line of profit, right? That was not the diktat, right? And in no way can we imagine that it was that in the Soviet Union. And production happened, imperfectly so, in order to respond to needs for use value, not exchange value. And yeah, so what I'm not saying that if the Soviet Union had not collapsed, then we wouldn't be in the predicament that we are in now. I mean, who knows, whatever the fuck would have happened. And one of the things that, that I really appreciate, Raja, about the book is the way that you take really seriously that about the conjuncture, and the way in which it's not whatever happened historically, like, neoliberalism kind of becoming the predominant narrative through which we understand legitimacy, political economic legitimacy, was not necessarily how it was always destined to go. It's not like a kind of this led to that and then it must have been so, but that it was a response to a moment of crisis, right? Yeah, that was a rant. I don't know what
I
Um,
mean, one thing I can say when you were talking about time, it's also about how there was a time in which things were done differently, life was organized differently. And to me, like, yeah, and now is a time in which things are done this way, or, and, to me, like, the fact that there was a time in which things were done differently is already kind of telling me that it's possible. I think a lot of times what I struggle with is like when I think so meta about these issues, I really get lost in like the mini, or like the what's the word? I mean, like the smaller things that, every day, like that we do, that is resistance, that is, doing things differently than what is trying to be imposed on us for us to do things a certain way, right? So I think that it's connected to that the memory of whatever was working for our survival at all times that we've survived, in all time frames that we have survived. And it could also just be like, I don't know, yesterday in some small situation. So yeah, that really sort of helps me when I struggle to with the meta questions.
One of the things I've been reminded of is that Lefebvre's argument around rhythm. He distinguishes between eurhythms and arrhythms or arrhythmia. Arrhythmia is when things are one cycle is kind of contradicting another one, or sort of is inimical to another one. So the ability of the soil to replenish itself is commercial agriculture does not respect that. So what it does is it exhausts the soil and then pumps in a bunch of fertilizers and all that in order to keep producing. Right? It doesn't work with the rhythm of the soil's natural replenishing cycles. Right? The ways in which various kinds of biological processes enable the soil to replenish, etc. Biological as well as other physical processes. But eurythmia would be when we can find ways to harmonize one rhythm with another. So a rhythm of social reproduction that's in harmony with the rhythm of natural cycles enables both to persist, right? And this I learned this way, kind of in the context of artisanal fishing in southern India. These folks are, they're considered primitive fishers and so on and so forth. But they have these really sophisticated ways of understanding how much to fish, when to fish, and very importantly, when not to fish, right? Stop grabbing everything, right? Let things, because those new fish stock, the new fish schools need to replenish. Now, if you go and kill everything off, you don't have nothing next year. Capital works within this sort of arrhythmic perspective because capital operates in a linear way, right? It goes grabs something when it's depleted, it goes find some other place to go and grab. And now we're in a situation where capital has fewer and fewer places to go and grab stuff because everything's being depleted, right? So a eurythmic approach would be one where you find ways to kind of harmonize these various rhythms. We need food. What's the capacity of the soil? What do we have here? What's available here? How might we organize social labor so we have an equal and egalitarian way of organizing social labor so we can produce and consume what we need, right? And if we don't have these things, so say you still want bananas, how might we get bananas from somewhere else where social labor is also organized along egalitarian principles in eurythmic relationship with between natural and social cycles, so we can now harmoniously develop a world. So again, the idea is not, okay, let's not consume anything anymore, or let's consume less, right? That won't be, so we want, I mean, we should be able to have good things, and socialism should be able to allow us to enjoy wonderful things, right? Because after all, the wealth of the proletariat should be shared, right, amongst all of us, right? We should be able to eat, chocolate or bananas, etc., etc., but under conditions that prioritize this sort of harmonious interaction. And again, it's not just a matter of just saying, hey, just let's do this just so we're kind of kind to nature, or we're friendly to the earth, etc., etc. But also, so this is the only way we can survive, right? Capital is like we're hurtling towards the cliff. And what's really shocking, I mean, Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president, made this point last year. He said what we're seeing in Gaza unfold is kind of is a almost a preview of what is going to come in the future with climate emergencies. When because of climate change, populations are struggling and are seeking help, are seeking to, to leave a particular place, to go into another place, or to, need things like water, need basic things, right? The kinds of responses we're seeing now, the kinds of actions we're seeing now in Gaza, are what might be, very shockingly so, in store for the rest of us. So we need to do this as a matter of survival. Develop these sort of eurythmic relationships between humans and nature, human cycles and natural cycles, while keeping, of course, human solidarities and human, compassion, etc., at the core in place. But developing these relationships so we can ensure both our survival of human populations and natural, natural processes. So, I didn't know that Annie Lennox and uh, "Sweet Dreams Are Made of These." You remember that song?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Called Eurythmics. I had no idea what Eurythmics were.
Now we know too.
Now we know too. Now I won't
The
forget.
kind of harmonious interaction of different rhythms. We can be different, right?
Yeah.
But we can find ways to interact harmoniously.
I
Right?
love
Difference does
this.
not mean,
Yeah.
To make for sweet dreams.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the next time I feel hopeless or powerless, I'm gonna try to like Google and find examples of eurythmic uh, th things and just get some hope from that. But I think this is a good place to end maybe today's episode. It's been a pleasure having you on, Raja. I've learned so much from you, and yeah, I can't wait for more people to get their hands on your book and to read it and to sort of to learn more and to be inspired and to, join the ranks of this struggle and trying to find solutions, I guess, or yeah, possibilities, more possibilities.
Thank you so much, Milena. Just a point about the book. The book is sold by some capitalist corporation, and they overcharge. So for those who want a copy, an electronic copy, more than happy to share. This is in the same spirit.
Could you give us your a good way of contacting you to get access to the book?
Yeah, anybody can email me at raja.swamy@gmail.com, and I'll send a link, or I'll just send the PDF. So yeah.
That's awesome.
Please,
Thank you, Raja.
I welcome people to not just read it, but if you want to argue with it and challenge and pose questions, absolutely. I mean, we do need to discuss this all together and argue about it so we can solve this.
Yeah.
The point is not the book. The point is, having a survivable, world where we can thrive together.
So please do access the book in whatever means you wish to do that. Please also comment here your thoughts on this interview and this conversation, as well as maybe thoughts on the book when you read it. You could also contact Raja with comments and thoughts and openings to debate and discussion, a dialectical approach. Thank you so much, Raja, for taking the time and talking with us today. We really enjoyed having you on, and I'm sure our listeners did too.
And a last reminder to please subscribe, like, comment, as Tamar said. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank
I
you.
forgot to say Bariv.
Bye.
Barev Uyev Hajarutun.
Yes, now we say Haja Hotun, Raja.
Ajawat.
Bye, everyone.